All right, everyone, we will go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight. My name is Megan Cole. I am the Kentucky Chapter Area Director. If you have any questions throughout, please feel free to drop them in the chat or in the Q&A box, and we'll address them after all of our speakers. We will be talking about suicide tonight, which can be a sensitive topic, and it's one that's personally affected many of us. So if at any point you feel the need to step away, feel free to mute me, step away from your computer, take some time for yourself. Know that the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is always available at 1-800-273-8255, or you can also text the crisis text line by texting TALK to 741-741. Additionally, we'll be talking about crisis aversion and rights retention, which does involve firearm talk. So if that is something that is sensitive to you, be cognizant of that as well and take some time to step away if you need to. I'm also going to put the Suicide Prevention Lifeline number and the crisis text line number in the chat so you can access those at any time throughout. So today you're going to be hearing me blabber on a little bit, and then you will be hearing from the real stars of the show, Whitney Austin, the founder of the WhitneyStrong Organization, as well as Senator Morgan McGarvey, who introduced the CAR legislature this year. So before we get to hear from them, I'm going to go through some federal and some state updates. I'm going to go through some advocacy 101 and some tips for connecting with your legislators. And then I'm going to go through AFSP's positioning on ERPO bills, and then hand it over to Whitney, where she'll talk about CAR and give you an overview. And Senator McGarvey will be there to discuss this as well and answer some questions. And then we'll have some time at the end for any of your questions. So first, we're going to start with some updates. On the federal level, we had a really big win this month. On May 12th, the House of Representatives passed a collection of mental health and suicide prevention bills. Some of these bills include providing mental health resources for youth in schools, enhancing health system suicide prevention capacity, prioritizing mental health of first responders, reducing mental health care disparities, and supporting the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. So we're encouraging you during this time to reach out to your members of Congress and thank your U.S. representative for taking action and urge your senator to pass these bills into law. So on a state level, we've had a lot happen this year too. I want to give some updates, especially for those of you who are able to join us for our advocacy day with the Kentucky Suicide Prevention Group and the Suicide Prevention Consortium of Kentucky. So first off, for anyone who isn't aware, a federal law was signed into law last year, officially changing the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline number to 988 in July of 2022. So 988 will be the new 911 for mental health, and it will be a one-stop number for assistance with mental health crises. Currently, to reach the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, we dial that 10-digit code I put in the chat, 800-273-8255. So making this number so much more easily accessible with a 3-digit code means we anticipate a much higher call volume. So the community mental health centers that answer the Lifeline in Kentucky and nationwide are already terribly underfunded. So it's going to be really critical that we ensure these centers are fully funded and staffed when 988 becomes a reality in July of 2022. So we need a fee on phone lines to help pay for this mental health emergency number. And this is part of the federal legislation and regulation. And it's the same way that 911 is funded. So if you participated in our state capitol day, we were already advocating for this, and we had a big win because Representative Bojanowski introduced a bill for us on this topic before the end of the session. Now, the bill needed some revision, and it will be reintroduced next year, but we have to get it passed. So we're going to really heavily strategize and need to gain support from legislators on both sides of the aisle to do this. So we are forming a 988 funding coalition in Kentucky to bring leaders from private and public entities across the state together to create a coordinated and strategic plan to get this important legislative passed. So stay tuned for some updates on this. Also this year, we advocated for a mental health parity bill, House Bill 50, which strengthens mental health parity in Kentucky. And this was signed into law during session. We also advocated for House Bill 77, which would require insurance companies to fund annual mental wellness exams. This was introduced but never assigned to committee. You're going to notice a little trend with that here because we advocated for bans on conversion therapy with House Bill 19 and Senate Bill 30, both introduced, never assigned to a committee in either chamber. And then after our state capitol week, CAR was introduced and we quickly signed on to support this. Again, it was introduced, never assigned to committee. Unfortunately, we saw leadership do this often this year. So we're going to talk about this quite a bit for our Advocacy 101 session. So first, for those of you who may be new to advocacy, we want to address the question, where does legislation come from? It comes from legislators themselves based on personal experiences, passions, and interests. And it comes from you as advocates and constituents. And it comes from organizations like AFSP and WhitneyStrong that work directly with legislators and other leading mental health organizations to write new policy and provide resources to support future legislation. So how a bill becomes a law, I don't know about you, but I always think of the Schoolhouse Rock song when this comes up. Once a legislator has an idea for a bill, they'll draft language and they'll introduce it. And once it's introduced, the legislation is assigned to the relevant committee within its house of origin, or it should be. This is a part of the process we saw a lot of important bills get stuck in this year. So it's assigned to a committee in either the House or Senate, wherever the bill is introduced. For example, if we work with a senator to introduce a bill to have all teachers trained in suicide prevention, this is already a law in Kentucky, so this is just an example. But that bill's house of origin is the Senate, and the bill will be sent to the Senate Education Committee since that's its relevant committee. The committee then has the opportunity to review, edit, and vote to approve the bill language before sending it to the floor for a full vote. If the bill is voted on favorably, it will go to the other house. So our teacher training bill, for example, if approved by the Senate Education Committee, will go to a full vote in the Senate, and only if the Senate votes favorably on it would it be moved to the House and go through the same committee process and review. Only when a bill has been voted on favorably in both houses can it go to the governor to be signed into law. Once received by the governor's office, the governor typically has a set number of days to act on the bill by signing it or vetoing all or part of the bill and sending it back to the House and Senate for additional edits or recommendations. So that's a whole lot of steps. There are a lot of steps in democracy and it takes time. And that's why our advocates are so important. You keep the momentum going. If we have more advocates involved with the process and actively contacting their legislators, bills like CAR are less likely to get stuck during this process. So let's talk about some tips on connecting so that you can help move these bills along. Here's how you can connect with your lawmakers to make change. The heart of advocacy is making the connection and sharing your story. Telling your story can save lives. It makes overwhelming statistics personal, and it lets people know that they are not alone and recovery is possible. So when talking about suicide, it's important to use safe messaging. AFSP advocates come from many different backgrounds. Some have lost a loved one to suicide. Some have had their own struggles or support someone who struggles. Some are professionally invested in this space through their work, and some are a combination of all the above. Telling your story can save lives, but only if you share it safely. So considering all of that, here are some reminders about safely sharing your story. You should be at a safe place in your recovery. You aren't required to speak out if you aren't ready yet. You can still advocate and send templates. You don't have to share your story if you're not ready. But if you are ready, here are some ways you can safely speak out. Avoid discussing details about method, as this may be triggering to those around you. Avoid glorifying suicide by using terms like successful attempt and instead say completed suicide or death by suicide. And then avoid using the word commit, as we often relate this words to crimes. Instead, say someone died by suicide or took their own life. We need to treat suicide like any other cause of death, and you don't say somebody committed cancer, you say they died from cancer. We also encourage you to always share mental health resources like the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline or the Crisis Text Line. And finally, practice. The more comfortable you are sharing your story and talking about suicide, the more we can break the stigma associated with mental health and suicide. One easy way to do this is by writing a vignette. So just write a few sentences about why suicide prevention is important to you. So now that you're ready to share your story, who do you share it with and how? You have to get to know your legislators. As you begin your advocacy journey, it's important to know what resources you have at your disposal. Legislative websites are a great tool. So for your members of Congress, at the federal level, go to www.congress.gov. And then our state legislative website is legislature.kentucky.gov. You can identify your legislator and their contact information here. You can see what laws are currently enacted. You can search for legislation that has been introduced in the current legislative session. And advocates can also sign up for newsletters and find out what relevant events and advocacy opportunities may be coming up in your area where you have the chance to make your voice heard. So here's how you connect with your story with your lawmakers. Speaking to your legislator can be intimidating, especially if you're a brand new advocate, but your elected officials are people just like you, and so are their staff. And they really want to hear from their constituents and they want to hear your concerns. That said, a lot of people want to talk to them about a lot of different things. So when speaking to a legislator or their staff, it's important to be polite and thank them for their time. And you also want to be mindful of the language that you use, as we discussed before, and then be brief when sharing your connection. Think of it as an elevator speech. So remember the vignette that we mentioned, that can help. So write a paragraph about why this specific piece of legislature is important to you. For example, if I was meeting with my legislator to talk about CAR, I might say, "Hi, my name is Megan Cole. I'm the Kentucky Area Director for the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. I got involved with suicide prevention after losing my Aunt Linda to suicide in 2014. After learning more about suicide, I realized that there are a lot of things all of us can do to help prevent this leading cause of death. I'd love to work with you to help bring down suicide rates in Kentucky, and I have some resources from the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention that can help guide some decisions when it comes to mental health and suicide prevention legislature. One thing we can do is reduce access to lethal means by providing a legal pathway to temporarily separate someone in crisis from their firearm, since over half of all suicide deaths are by firearm, and that number is even higher in Kentucky. I'm happy to provide you with any resources or answer any questions you may have. Thank you so much for your time." So after your elevator speech, your legislator and their staff might have some questions, and they almost always do. And you might not always know the answer, and that's okay. Just say, "I do not know the answer to that right now, but I will be happy to find out and follow up with you." Don't be embarrassed about this. This is a really great opportunity because we're here to support you if you're stumped. And as a bonus, you now have the opportunity to maintain connection with that office and further position yourself as a resource for them in the future. So there are a lot of ways to build relationships and stay connected with your lawmakers throughout the year. You can email and call them through the AFSP Action Center. You can tag them in social media posts. You can meet with them or their staff virtually or over the phone or by video, and sign up for newsletters so you know when they're hosting town halls and any events in your area. Many town halls and legislative meetings are now being held virtually and offer a lot of increased opportunity for advocates to become engaged in the legislative process. So this is what the AFSP Action Center looks like. If you go to afsp.org/action center, you can contact your legislators on the state and federal level. And an action takes as little as 2 minutes. There will be a template in for whatever bill you are advocating for. And I do recommend personalizing it if you're comfortable with it, as it can help connect the legislator a little more with the cause. So after this webinar, try it out, visit that site, explore it a little, and find out a little more about some of the other bills that we're advocating for. So before we move on to discussing the crisis aversion and rights retention, I want to briefly go over AFSP's positioning on extreme risk protection orders. So while CAR is not an ERPO bill, it has similarities, and this section will help explain why AFSP chose to strongly support CAR, and Whitney will, of course, be able to explain this further. So suicide risk always increases when lethal methods like firearms are readily accessible. Firearms are the most lethal means for suicide and account for over 50% of suicide deaths. And most firearm deaths in general are suicides. So this is a big part of suicide prevention. Individuals at risk for suicide who have a firearm in the home are more likely to involve it in their plan. Putting time and distance between a person in suicidal crisis and a lethal method can save lives. Research provides clear evidence that in that moment of crisis, time and distance can be life-saving measures. It gives time for the intense suicidal risk to diminish and distance between the individual who's suicidal and the method for ending their life. With that said, I'm going to turn it over to my friend Whitney Austin. She's the founder of the WhitneyStrong organization, and she has been the driving force behind CAR. She'll be able to tell you what makes CAR such a unique bill and why it is absolutely critical to reducing suicide rates and saving lives in Kentucky.
Thanks, Megan. Am I going to share the deck myself?
Yeah, you can.
Okay, great. Everybody see it as I'm scrolling to the top, right?
Yes.
Well, first, let me say thank you. I'm a strong supporter of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. I went on the walk in 2019, and then of course 2020 hit, and I'm eager to be back in person in 2021 with all of you. So thank you for the work that you do. Suicide prevention is very important to me individually, and then also to my organization, WhitneyStrong. But before I jump into CAR, I thought I would take it from the beginning, really why I got involved in all of this work. And this is a picture of me after I was involved in a mass shooting that occurred on September 6, 2018 in Cincinnati, Ohio. You may have heard of it. It was at the Fifth Third Bank headquarters on Fountain Square. And while I have been a Louisvillian most of my life, I spent a lot of time in Cincinnati with nearly 16 years of work at Fifth Third. And so that day was just like any other day walking into corporate headquarters until I was met with a shooter in a mass shooting. I won't give you all the details, but the most important thing is that I was shot 12 times, and not once did any of those bullets hit a major organ or artery. And there is, in my mind, no explanation for that. I've thought about it quite a bit. And instead of spending more time thinking about that, I spend most of my time thinking about how to pay forward that gift to ensure that no one else has to go through what I went through, and not just mass violence, every form of gun violence that exists. So that's the genesis for why I do this work and really why WhitneyStrong was founded. A little information about our organization. Our mission is finding common ground to end gun violence through data-driven, responsible gun ownership solutions. We are very unique in our approach in that we are focused on reducing gun violence through responsible gun ownership. We have just as many board members that are gun owners as non-gun owners, just as many board members that are Republicans versus Democrats. We're not here to make this a political issue. We're here to make it a public health issue and do everything that we can to see the numbers reverse, because they are headed in the wrong direction. We focus on doing that in 3 ways. First is through education. So we offer a whole host of prevention, evidence-based prevention trainings in the communities that see the highest levels of gun violence in Louisville and in Cincinnati. One, of course, is QPR that I know you guys are all familiar with. But we allow our community partners to choose the trainings that make the most sense for them and offer these trainings free of service, and then also provide them If they were to choose Stop the Bleed, for example, tourniquets for free. If they were to choose firearm safety, gun locks for free. So all of that is provided to those communities at no charge. Secondly, we're focused on research. You may or may not know there is a dearth in research on gun violence prevention. It goes back to the Dickey Amendment in the mid-90s. We did have a win in 2019 where finally 25 million was allocated to the CDC and the NIH, but we're talking decades without research. So we are not where we should be. We can't say with great confidence on a lot of solutions that these will make a difference in reducing gun violence. So where Whitney Strong can help, we will. And we just funded a research project with Cincinnati Children's to help reduce firearm suicide with adolescents. And then lastly, there's the legislative piece. And we pride ourselves in being nonpartisan and moving forward with bills that have bipartisan support. And not only in Kentucky, but also in Ohio and then at the federal level. There's my little picture there that I have to point out where we were all together at your walk, and again, looking forward to doing it in the future. A couple of things that, I think speak to the work that you guys do as well. The pandemic was odd for all of us, and so we thought about what we could do in a safe way. And where we landed is the distribution of gun locks. And so over the course of the last year, we distributed over 12,000 gun locks across the states of Kentucky and Ohio with multiple partnerships. So partnering with the National Shooting Sports Foundation, like you all do on suicide prevention, we distributed through them and law enforcement. And then on the opposite side of the spectrum, partnered with the Kentucky chapter for the American Academy of Pediatrics to make sure that gun locks and suicide prevention materials are getting to our pediatricians across the state. So you can see the other stuff that we've been behind, but continuing to underline strongly our focus on suicide prevention as a method of reducing gun violence. This is some data around what gun violence looks like in the state of Kentucky. Some of it may be familiar to you as advocates yourself, but approximately 1,700 people a year are shot in the state of Kentucky. Another 720 will die by firearm each year in the state of Kentucky. The second leading cause of death is firearms for our Kentuckians ages 1 to 24. We're not winning. Our firearm death rate is nearly 1.5 times higher than national average. And then, as Megan said earlier, nearly 2 in 3 firearm deaths in Kentucky are suicide. You can also see that we're not trending in the right direction. Our fatality rate has increased 20% in the last decade. And then our homicide rate has increased 62% in the last decade. And that doesn't include 2020, which is for sure on record the most violent year of homicide that we've seen in 2 decades nationally. This is just a picture, a moment in time in 2019. How did firearm deaths play out? And you can see that 445 to suicide, 201 to homicide, and 36 to other. And this is why every time I have a conversation with a legislator, I bring up suicide prevention, because it is the biggest number in the firearm deaths we see each year in Kentucky. And then this is some data that I had pulled for an op-ed that I wrote in support of CAR. But between 1999 and 2019, our suicide rate increased 30% more than the national rate. And as Megan shared also, most Kentuckians who die by suicide over the past decade used a firearm at 64%, and that is 13 percentage points higher than the national average. So what can we do? What can we do about all of these things? Now, CAR, Crisis Aversion and Rights Retention, is not a solution to end all gun violence. You should know that. It is a complex problem, and it will take many solutions working in concert to solve the problem, but that is not an excuse to sit by and say there's nothing we can do about this. Like so many people say, so many fatalistic attitudes. But crisis aversion and rights retention is certainly something that we can do to reduce both suicides and mass violence within our state. And it has been a solution that I have personally and our organization has been focused on since the very beginning in the early stages of 2019. I just wanted to give you a picture of all the people involved in this bill and know that it's not just Whitney Austin, it's many, many people coming together to lend their expertise. And then of course, our very important legislators that continue to move it forward. So for my organization, I've got, my husband and myself, again, not just us, many other board members, but really the point within the organization. And then we have had tremendous help from Sandy Hook Promise, who has many, many years of experience as that shooting occurred in 2012, working on both state legislatures and federal legislation. And so you can see the team that has assisted. Down below is Jen Poliakonis, who's from the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence out of DC. If you do any research on them, you'll see that they were behind the very first extreme risk protection order bill that happened in California. So if you want to move forward with a risk warrant law, you certainly want to work with the organization that wrote the language. So we've been so lucky to have Jen and her team involved to help us with a lot of the legalese and the statutes. And so over to the left, the most important people in all of this are our legislators. And to the left is Senator Paul Hornback, who is a Republican and the sponsor of the bill from 2021, and then Senator Morgan McGarvey, who will be joining us here shortly. He is a Democrat. Personally, he is my senator, and he's been involved since the very beginning. Just to give you a little bit of history on the bill, it did start out as an extreme risk protection order. That was back in 2019. We had a hearing on the bill in both the House and the Senate. Now this was interim, so it wasn't during session, which is why both of the chambers came together within the judiciary for the hearing. But it was really a big deal. A hearing like that has not happened, we say, in the last decade. It could have very well been the last 2 decades that both committees came together to listen to solutions for preventing gun violence. So it was a big deal. And also a big deal moving forward because feedback continued to trickle in after that hearing to help us customize a bill for the state of Kentucky. That is what led to crisis aversion and rights retention, which is really what we led with in 2021. And I'll talk a little bit more later about the things that we did to customize it that make it truly right for Kentucky and just not a national template of an extreme risk protection order bill. If we fast forward to 2021, the bill was filed. Megan gave you the history. It just didn't make it to committee. And so we have to change that. We want to have an interim committee come the fall of this year. And then again, move forward in 2022 with filing, get us to a committee, get us a hearing, and get us a vote. You have to keep moving it forward. It's getting it further every year. So Megan did an excellent job of telling you what an extreme risk protection order is all about. I like to add a little color to that. As an organization, we are very focused on talking about how this is a solution for gun owners, right? This is a solution to help gun owners in a moment of crisis, because everybody can have a moment of crisis, gun owner or not. And if you can intervene in that moment of crisis and get them the help that they need, we can prevent an act of suicide, or we can prevent an act of mass violence. And if we do that, we can get them, in some cases, back to a place in which gun ownership is safe and they can be reunited with their gun. And I think the best example of that is someone that could have suicidal thoughts or ideation, getting them the help that they need so they get back to a place in which gun ownership is safe and retaining that firearm for whatever reason they had it in the first place, whether it's hunting, it's sport, protection of their family, etc. And so I like to just give an example of how this would work in the real world so you can start to grasp it. So let's say you have a brother who is at imminent risk of harming himself or others. We won't decide either one. We'll just say, at imminent risk of hurting himself or others. And you have tried to do everything you can, to make the situation better, but nothing is working. And so you're really at a point where you have evidence of, here is all of his behavior that leads me to, he is at an imminent risk. you would then approach a member of law enforcement, because the way our bill is set up, that's the additional filter. And traditionally, law enforcement is in the best position to assess risk. So they'll take your information, the evidence that you've presented, and decide, is this truly a risk? Is this truly imminent? If yes, then the member of law enforcement has the opportunity to petition for a CAR order through court. So here in Louisville, for example, it would be through district court. The judge then adds as an additional layer of protection, an additional layer of due process for the individual who is considered the respondent. And then the judge is not only going to review the evidence that's provided by the member of law enforcement, the evidence provided by the person who brought the concern to law enforcement. They will then need to decide, has the burden of proof been met? Is this person truly showing all the signs and behaviors that this is imminent risk of harming themselves or others? If the judge decides yes, then the member of law enforcement will go back to your brother and his place of residence, will collect the firearms from your brother, and then your brother will need to wait 2 weeks to have a hearing, an evidentiary hearing. At that point, your brother will show up at the evidentiary hearing with the judge in the district court. And now there's a higher level burden of proof threshold that must be met, because now we're deciding, the judge is deciding, is your brother going to be separated from the firearm for more than 2 weeks? It could be up to a term of 1 year. Let's say the burden of proof has been met. Your brother is going to have to stay away from his firearms for, let's just say in this instance, it was granted for a year. If your brother wants to request a petition for another hearing, he can, to say, look, these are all the things that have changed and why I'm in a safer place now and why I can be reunited with my firearm. And on the reverse, the member of law enforcement could say, let's just say at 10 months before the 12-month period ends, we need to extend this order because this person is not back to a place in which gun ownership is safe. So it can go both ways, but certainly there are due process protections built into the process through the district court system to ensure it's not just something that's being granted, not to mention the additional layers of protection saying it has to first go through law enforcement before it's moved over to that judge in district court. The hope is that the person gets the assistance that they need for whatever reason they were in that crisis moment. And again, they can be reunited with their firearm, preventing a crisis of many different types of crises that could erupt from not taking that additional step. I do want to share that we did polling. As an organization, we really have 2 criteria for moving forward with legislation. One, we want to make sure that it's supported by the majority. And then secondly, we want to make sure that it's proven to be effective. And CAR fits both of those criteria. So we did this poll in 2019, and it shows that 8 out of 10 voters in Kentucky would be as likely or more likely to vote for their legislator if they supported a risk protection bill. And I'm sorry I didn't update this slide. We actually did another poll in 2020 where we specifically outlined CAR versus, because this was for a risk protection bill, but it was the same results, 8 out of 10. And this was polling that was done with registered voters across the state of Kentucky and did great representation of really the 5 big geographic areas. And then I talked about what we require, and that it's proven to be effective. And that's exactly what CAR has. And if you hold on 1 second, I'm just going to send Senator McGarvey a text real quick and say, join us. So proven to be effective. And there's a lot of research out there on extreme risk protection orders, or risk warrant laws, as we call them, especially because, again, California and Indiana have had them all the way back to, there you go, you can see it, 1999. So almost before we turned into the new century. So this study, people cite all the time, was done by Dr. Jeff Swanson at Duke University. He examined a risk warrant law in Indiana from 99 to 2013. And what they found was for every 10 to 20 orders, at least 1 suicide was prevented. And also they found that people that were subject to these orders had an annual suicide rate that was 40 times higher than the general population. So essentially they were getting to the people that needed to be identified to prevent suicides. The Indiana study was from 2006 to 2013, and they found for every 10 orders, 1 suicide was prevented. But that same thing, very targeted in getting to the people that need help most, annual suicide rates 31 times higher. Now, on the flip side, is it effective at preventing mass violence? And this research is much more recent. I don't have the date on here, but I feel like this is something I've read as recently as 2019. This was a study from UC Davis with Dr. Garen Wintemute. He examined 159 orders issued in California, which is one of the 19 states that has risk warrant laws. And in 21 orders, the subject showed clear signs that they intended to commit mass violence, and no mass shootings, suicides, or homicides associated with those orders occurred following the risk warrant order. And then this is from a study that happened in Washington State in 2020, and it gives you an idea of how the risk warrants are being used. So of 238 warrants, orders issued for self-harm were 67, harm to others 86, or to prevent both harm to others and self 84. Now, Washington allows for a broader scope of who can petition. And in this case, most of the petitioning happened by law enforcement. You can see that 30% of respondents ordered a court-ordered mental health evaluation. So they concluded that these protection orders in the state of Washington can help individuals gain access to mental health care on top of preventing an act of mass violence or suicide. And then I want to conclude before passing it over to Senator McGarvey. How can you assist with this effort? And there are many, many things that can be done a little bit further down the road, right? I'm going to need all of your help when we get to that hearing, whether it's participating in the hearing or sending emails on our behalf to senators and representatives to let them know that you support CAR, because we end up really needing thousands and thousands of emails and calls of support. But at this moment in time, the most valuable thing you can do to assist us in our effort is to add your signature to our petition. It is very powerful when you can go to a legislator and say, look, within your district, I have 1,000 signatures showing that your constituents support our work, and extremely powerful when it's coming in the more rural areas of the state. So I've put the link here, the hyperlink. It's whitneystrong.org/CAR. It's really simple to add your signature, and to please share it with as many people you know, especially across the state of Kentucky. It's easier to get them out of Louisville and more difficult outside of Louisville. So if you have connections outside of the city, we would greatly appreciate you getting us some signatures. So I'm going to pass it over to Senator McGarvey now.
Thank you, Whitney. I appreciate it. And I apologize for the background noise, but my wife is out of town because things are returning back to normal. And I am at the parent-child soccer kickball game banquet tonight. And so I'm joining you guys for just a few minutes. But I hope that shows you all not a disrespect, but how important I think this is, and the work that Whitney has done and what she's done to put this forward, because I think this has a real chance. And as Whitney's been outlining, I have been listening on the call while on the kickball field. We saw the number of deaths by suicide that involved a firearm, and what a startling statistic that is. And of course, how many suicide deaths actually come from firearms. And I'm tired of people saying there's nothing we can do when we're doing nothing. And so what CAR represents is truly a bipartisan approach born out of the Extreme Risk Protection Order movement, but tailored specifically to Kentucky so that people do keep their rights. There is due process. I think there's a really cool step in this bill, which is a lot of times in extreme risk protection orders, almost anybody can file one, or at least there's a large class of people that can file one. But with CAR, only a police officer can file to have a dangerous person's firearm removed. And what this does is, one, it makes some people feel better about keeping their rights, but two, what we found is a lot of times family members are uncomfortable taking out a court order against another family member, and this takes them out of this process. So it's something we continue to push. It's something we're pushing in this interim, and it's something that I really hope continues to gain momentum, and that Kentucky can be a leader on this very important topic.
Thank you so much, Senator McGarvey and Whitney. We do have a question, if you have a moment. What's the one most important thing we can say to those who have issues and strongly oppose any type of restrictions or temporary removal?
Yeah, I think you have to listen first. So the most important thing you can say is to listen. Let people know you understand their concerns, but then go through the bill and talk about how people's rights are protected. Not just in the due process we have built into the statute, but the fact even a person who is a subject of a crisis aversion rights retention order is guaranteed a right to counsel in this matter before they actually have a firearm permanently removed. And when I say permanent, there is no permanency to this. It's always a temporary. It's always a temporary removal.
Okay, and we have one more question. Is there a potential for racial bias if the determination is left to a police officer? This is a very hot topic right now. Is there anything we can do to help prevent that?
You have to say yes. There is a potential for racial biases. There's a potential for racial bias in anything. What makes this slightly different is that it is someone related to the person who might be a danger to themselves or others who's making that report to the police. And I think this is something that law enforcement is going to take very seriously, because if a family member is taking the time to contact law enforcement to say, my loved one's in trouble, I think the police wouldn't want to say we ignored this report, especially if something absolutely tragic happened.
Absolutely.
So that's a larger conversation that we are having, should be having, need to continue to have, that goes into training and all sorts of things. But yeah, it's an issue. We've talked about it, and obviously I hope it's one that doesn't happen.
Yeah, and it will certainly go along with our efforts to train first responders in suicide prevention as well. One thing I did want to point out, and if anybody has any questions, now's the time. You can put them in the chat or in the Q&A. A lot of times an argument to any sort of ERPO law is that if you take away the firearm, they're just going to find another method. And research shows that's not true. If we take away the chosen method, the person is not going to seek something else out. So when somebody is in the midst of a suicidal crisis, they get intense tunnel vision and they can't see a way out of that crisis, and thinking becomes unclear. I always use the example, think about the most painful thing you've ever experienced physically, whether that be a broken bone, whether it be childbirth, a kidney stone. In that moment of intense pain, could you have given somebody clear and accurate directions to your house? Probably not. And so the pain makes ordinary thinking unbearable. So they're not going to move on to another method because it's a level of problem solving that someone doesn't have in that moment of crisis. Do we have any other questions?
Yeah, I just want to add that's a really good one, and it comes up all the time. So being prepared to answer in that way will benefit you. In fact, you just reminded me of a better way to answer when it comes up. It comes up all the time.
Okay, we have a couple more questions. Which states have a similar law currently?
So I might be off by one state or I have it completely accurate. So 19 states have extreme risk protection orders. I'm not going to be able to list them all, but surrounding us, Indiana is the only one that does. But Florida has it. They passed it in the wake of the Parkland shooting. If you go up north, Massachusetts has it. Out west, you have California that has it. Colorado is one of the most recent states to bring ERPO. So it's really a mixed bag across the country, and also a mixed bag of states in terms of their political leanings, conservative and liberal.
Awesome. And then with some of the issues we're seeing publicly with police, what are some things that we can do in messaging to encourage people to use this process if it becomes law, and to make sure that they're trusting the process?
Yeah, well, it's kind of like two big chunks, right? The first thing you have to do is get the law or turn the bill into law. And then the second thing you need to do is messaging and education. I mentioned Indiana has this law. And if you're following along with mass violence the way I do, you know that there was just a mass shooting at the FedEx Center or the FedEx warehouse in Indianapolis. And much of the news coverage following was, but Indiana has extreme risk protection orders. What happened? Why wasn't it used properly? And in some ways, I think it exposed some of the deficiencies of their version. They have one of the very first ones, and it certainly has some deficiencies. But you could argue on top of the deficiencies that the public education campaign was non-existent, because people need to know that these laws exist and that they can be utilized. So my answer is, we're not there yet to put together that public education campaign. But once this passes, that will be phase 2, because we will have not done the hard work of passing a law just to let no one use it. And it's not just educating us as everyday people on how to use it, it's educating law enforcement so that they are able to take that lead. That is, again, meeting the criteria of imminent harm to self or others, and appropriately get it over to the judge. You also have to educate the judges. So there are many, many steps that must be completed, but you have to take it one step at a time, right?
Yeah, so we'll definitely be working to educate the public, to educate police officers and other law enforcement and anyone involved in the judicial process. We have a couple more. Does the bill account for unmarried or cohabitating partners, or is it solely for direct family members?
It's for anyone. It could be your brother, it could be your neighbor, it could be a kid at the school, it could be anyone. You need to have evidence, right, that they are an imminent risk to themselves or others. But if you have that evidence, then you will be able to take it to law enforcement, where those 2 additional filters are applied, both the member of law enforcement and then the judge making the final determination. But that is, one of the really wonderful things about it is it solves for all situations. We have a legal path to temporarily separate, not even temporarily, permanently separate someone from their firearm in an incident of domestic violence. But that's it. We don't have any other scenario covered. And so that's why this law is so important.
And does the reporter remain anonymous?
That's one I'm going to have to get back to you. Megan told you that sometimes you have to say that. I'm not sure technically if there wouldn't be some record in the evidence that's presented by the member of law enforcement to the judge. But I can get that answer, because now I'm curious myself. And if there is concern about that, please send Megan your feedback in my way. And, we have plenty of time before next session to make adjustments to the language of the bill. So.
Absolutely. And thank you for demonstrating that, because I always worry that people will make up an answer, and we should never do that. We should admit when we don't know something. We have one more. Can you talk about the differences and similarities between this bill and the law Indiana has in place?
The law in Indiana, well, so first off, I can tell you the big stuff that we changed that makes ours different than kind of the national template. And it boils down to, well, one thing's too technical, so I'm not going to go into that. But the other 2 things, a responsible party. So many of the legislators who are presenting the feedback of their constituents shared that they were concerned about high value firearms, and honestly, any firearm in general, not being cared for in the appropriate way. And so in their minds, the gun is temporarily separated from the individual and thrown into a storage unit in some, office and not cared for. However, if we allowed for a responsible party who's non-cohabitating, they could come to a judge and say, I can be a responsible party, criteria for being a responsible party, but then that person can store the firearm while the individual needs to be separated from it. And so that was one big change. And then secondly, the whole getting help component. So we're very careful to say that, a requirement of a CAR order is not a mental health evaluation. However, once the order has been issued by the judge, and we'll just say the long-term order that's up to 1 year, making sure that that respondent has plenty of opportunity and access to services to help get them better. That was something we heard very loud and clear from the legislature. If you just take the gun away, that doesn't solve for the underlying issue. We need to solve for the underlying issue. And so you see a little bit of that with the national template and the other laws, but not as much as there should be. And so we're very proud of how that makes ours different. As far as Indiana is concerned, it's interesting, you know, back again, they've had it since 1999. It was a very different political landscape. Everybody but one legislator voted yes. It came about as a result of an instance in which a member of law enforcement lost his life by someone who suffered severe and chronic mental illness, and they had taken the firearm away from that individual, but they didn't have the legal right to keep it, and then they returned it, and then within a couple of months, that same individual took the same member of law enforcement's life. So that's the genesis of their bill. And what is interesting and why there's this different is they don't have many of the due process protections in place. They can actually take that firearm in the initial stage without an order being issued, without a warrant, based upon evidence that this person is an imminent risk to themselves or others. The evidentiary hearing that comes down the road is very similar to what we've set up, but in those initial stages, they can act quite aggressively to just take that firearm. So I think, you know, on our side, we've taken many more steps to protect gun owners and their right to their firearm.
Thank you so much. If we didn't get to your question, please follow up with me on email. I'll go ahead and put that in the chat. And if you have a question, if you're like me, you'll think of a question at like 3 a.m, go ahead and send me that email. Whitney and I will be happy to get that answer for you. I just have a couple things in closing and ways that you can take action in addition to signing on to support CAR at the link that Whitney shared earlier. So if you haven't already, become an AFSP advocate. afsp.org/advocate. This is a really easy way that you can get involved. It will send you action updates every once in a while whenever there's an important piece of legislature at the federal level or at the state level. It'll give you a template that you can fill out. You can personalize it however you'd like. It takes about 2 minutes to fill out. It is a very easy way to make your voice heard. You can engage with your community by recruiting other advocates. Like Whitney said, we have a really high concentration of advocates in Louisville, but not so much around the rest of the state. So it's going to be really important that we're engaging people from all over the state so that we have support in every district. You can share your connection to the cause through a vignette. You can share this to introduce yourself to your legislator. You can take action and contact your legislators, and you can promote suicide prevention on social media. We're at Kentucky AFSP, and you can use hashtag AFSP advocacy. We'd love to see the steps that you're taking. And always you can tag your legislators if there's something that we share and you want them to make sure that they know. There's tons of resources for you to learn more. afsp.org/advocacy resources has different public policy webinars. It has sample videos of meetings with legislators. afsp.org/priorities has all of our different issue briefs that you can bring along with you to any meetings or to any sort of town halls. You can track bills at our Action Center. And you can also look at all the latest statistics at afsp.org/statistics. So I also wanted to invite you to some of our upcoming events. We have a brand new presentation, Introduction to Supporting Those at Risk. So if you have a loved one who struggles with suicide, this is a really great way to find out how to better support them through their process of recovery. We also have a Kentucky chapter volunteer orientation on May 27th if you're interested in getting more involved with the chapter. And then this was the first of a whole series of town halls that we're going to be doing on this chapter. In June, we'll be announcing that date shortly. We'll be partnering with Ban Conversion Therapy Kentucky to talk about what we can be doing to help ban conversion therapy. In September, you'll hear a lot more about funding 988 and how we can fully fund the local answering centers for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And then in November, we will do a final one on preparing for the 2022 session, give you some of our priorities, go over some tips again, and let you in on some of our strategy going into the 2022 session. Thank you so much for being here with us today. I ended on time. Everyone be very proud of me. And be sure to get connected with us. We're at Kentucky AFSP on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And you can visit afsp.org/Kentucky to see all of our events. You can find my contact info there. And please engage with us because we really need you in this fight. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.